Okay, I'll figure it out. Coaches, welcome to our masterclass with Ryan Pannone. And no stranger to basketball immersion, people, Coach. I've shared a lot of your clips over the years, and you've been on the basketball podcast, one of the really popular ones, obviously, that has built a lot of fascination in rebounding, offensive rebounding, and some of the individual development of rebounding. So really cool in terms of that. And we're going to dive into a whole bunch of things. First, coaches, welcome. And hopefully you can hear me, but post any questions in the chat anytime. Don't wait. Coach is great. If you follow him on Twitter, and I even see one of your assistant coaches joined us, TJ Saint. So hopefully TJ will be able to add some insights to it as well.
Yeah,
Welcome,
Saint.
Coach. You got it.
He has the best hair on this whole chat, including everyone that's in there for sure.
Hard to beat us, Coach. It's hard to beat us. So, coaches, we're going to start real quick. Coach Pannone gave me a bunch of ATOs to share, and I'll gradually get a chance to be able to do that. But I thought we'd start off with just a brief question about, well, it might not be brief, but a question about ATOs and what is the anatomy of an ATO for you in terms of deciding to use a certain ATO?
For me, it comes down to really scouting the opponents. So I try to, our assistants do a really good job of preparing different edits, but I try to go through and watch whether it's their pick and roll defense, their cut defense, off ball screen defense, end of game defense, and try to figure out what are some of the weaknesses, what are some similar type actions that other coaches have run against them. So let's say we were preparing for the Windy City Bulls, and the way that they play their pick and roll defense, they try to show hard on the pick and roll, which means that they're attached to the big guys on any type of back screen action. So we were trying to utilize that to run some back screen action for lobs, for layups, because their bigs wouldn't help off and track the pass. And so that's kind of how I try to go through it, and just from studying it and watching and thinking, okay, this is type action we need to run, and then going through my database of plays that I either really like or things that I've come up with throughout the years to attack them that way.
Well, you have a huge database, and that's both a strength and a weakness, I imagine, because you have so many different ideas. And so how do you, beyond understanding the opponent, what are some other things that help you move forward with a certain play? Is it one that you've seen work before? Is it your personnel too? What are some other things?
A lot of it is personnel based, and obviously making sure that the right guys are in the game. So typically based off the way that we're subbing, I may script our ATOs. So I may know that a guy that's a really good shooter will be in by the second media timeout. So I'll have that ATO saved for him. And so as I'm writing ATOs down on my game card, I kind of plan it out for who it may be. So it's specific personnel related. And then obviously looking for different matchups, different people to attack in situations, whether it's a smaller guard on a bigger guard. And so we ran a lot of actions just out of different post ups, really for shooting actions out of the post. We did a pretty good job at that. And that was a big key of it. And then for the database portion, some of it might be another team that I've seen run it, especially European teams. I really like the way that at the international game, Europe and Australia and Asia, the way that they play the game of basketball. And then I just have an ideas folder. So sometimes I'll see something that gives me a different idea on a different action or similar to a type play that we already run, but to just add a little tweak ATO to it.
I like that. And definitely the international games had a big influence on you in terms of that. Are you finding that some of the plays or some of the ATOs that you're running are a little bit different? Because again, it tends to be a copy league to a certain extent, G League, NBA, in terms of you see a lot of the same type of plays come out when they find success with certain ones. Are you finding you're running some different stuff because of your European experience?
Yeah, I think we run definitely different ATOs than the other coaches, and doesn't mean that they're better. But it's got a different flavor just from what I've seen from Europe, because obviously I'm watching the NBA, I break down different end of game situations, ATOs from some of the coaches I enjoy watching, some of the NBA teams. But then, I really, really enjoy, and I think that the greatest basketball is played internationally. So I really try to pull more from there.
I know we both enjoy the international game. That's been a big influence on both of our careers and our coaching. And I'm going to practice, in the G League situation. Give people an impression. You get more practices in a G League situation than you would in an NBA situation, right?
That would be a good question for TJ Saint.
TJ,
TJ, our assistant who's on, has been, was with the Detroit Pistons for 4 years and worked for Brad Stevens and Rick Byrd and Stan Van Gundy and Tom Crean. And it's more of a question for him. I tell you this, you get a lot less practices than what you do in Europe. That's for sure.
Well, and that was going to be the next question. But TJ, you're unmuted if you want to answer that. I'm not going to put your video in, but I unmuted you if you can answer.
Yeah, you get about 1.5 practices a week in a typical NBA week. I'd say, our season in Erie was a little bit, sometimes we'd have 3 games, sometimes we'd have 1 or 2. So I'd say we got 2 to 3 practices a week, so probably double in the G League.
Yeah, I think we vary what a practice is. I think we vary.
Yeah, no, we do. That's a good point.
I would argue. I would say we probably had 1 practice and then like 1 where people come together and do basketball-related things, but I don't count that a practice. But no, I obviously we get a little bit more.
Yeah, you get more, and that's the curiosity a little bit with the G League because it's supposed to be developmental. But I think a lot of coaches don't appreciate how inconsistent your roster is, though, right? Even up until game time, you might not know who's on your roster that game, right?
You might not know who's on your roster, and you might not know who's on the opposing team's roster. And
of course.
It becomes a little bit hard for our assistant coaches because they have to prepare for, at times, 12 different guys. And so you'll put a guy in the scouting report that you watch early on with your players, and then you find out right before he's not playing. And you can build your game plan kind of around that specific player. And so now you've wasted a day of practice, maybe shoot around on a guy that may or may not be playing. And so that becomes difficult in your preparation. And, you may go into a back-to-back where you've got some guys for the first game and you think you've got them for sure for the second game, and then they leave directly after the game. And now you have to readjust the way that you're attacking the second team.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Coach Jordan Newman has the first question for you, which is he agrees about the international game, but he's curious as to why you think international basketball is better, specifically, from your perspective.
Number one, I think that the game is a more fundamental game. The typical American game is more isolation-based, more one-on-one based, less ball flow, less movement. I think the care factor in winning is lower. It's more about the individuals. All of the individual highlight tapes that you see from high school and from AAU, you'll see the individual tapes after 3 losses in a row. And to where in Europe, every game matters. You can be the worst team in the league. When I was in Israel the previous year, the worst team in the league was expected to win. They fired 4 coaches in the same season. So you're taught as a player and as a coach, every game matters, every preparation matters. So your focus and mindset are totally different because as a coach, you can literally sign a 2-year deal and get fired in the preseason of your first year. And, I signed as a head coach in Slovakia, 3-year deal. They were almost fired me in the preseason of my first year. And then through the first 9 games, we were 5-4. Our best player and center was out, and we had a few other injuries. We started 5-4, and if I would have gone 5-5, I would have gotten fired. And instead, fortunately, we finished 26-11. But the mentality and the pressure on winning is higher. And then everything is team play. It's not – you don't see a whole lot of individual highlight videos from international players put up throughout the course of the season, whether it's high school prospects, college prospects, or pro prospects. Now, you'll see it after the season, but the emphasis on the individual is not there. And I think if you watch him play, it's less dribbling, right? You'll constantly see him make 2, 3, 4 passes in the same possession without dribbling. And even the guys that are handling it, right? They'll play a pick and roll, get off it, chase it back, play a secondary pick and roll, spray it out, as opposed to dribbling it 15 times. And it comes down to between everything. Even the way that we attack switches, right? The way that we attack a switch in America is one-on-one based, whether you're playing one-on-one on the perimeter or you're playing one-on-one through the post. And in Europe, to attack the switch, it's played between 3 and 5 players. You may still attack it off the perimeter. You may still attack it on the post, but you're doing it through a team. There's 2-3 passes involved to try to attack the switch. And then obviously you have now the NBA concept, the boomerang, where guards are getting off it and getting it back. But I think that's some of the differences between the game that makes it better. And it's a very tactical game. The game there is coached because every game matters. You're coaching it like it's the NCAA tournament or the NBA playoffs, because literally you can lose and get fired.
Well, I saw it this year with Hoda, who was on our podcast, and I was checking in and he's no longer the coach, and that's in the middle of I didn't think that bad a season, but it's crazy times. Coach Mark asks, do you focus more on your own stuff due to inconsistent rosters? How does this affect your preparations for what to put in or not put in?
In the G League, it's a lot more self-scouting because, the G League, you're focused on getting your players to pass the basketball to each other, to play hard, to remember your plays, your defensive concepts, and to play as a team. And so, you can focus on 2-3 plays for the other team, and it's a little bit more personnel-based. You're focused more personnel than necessarily their actions, because so many G League teams run the same stuff, so you're kind of prepared for most teams, not all teams, but most teams' main 2-3 actions. But definitely you're focused on sticking to your rules and not changing it. Obviously in Europe and in the NBA, you're deciding, okay, we're playing against Steph Curry, we're going to defend him in the pick and roll this way. Okay, we're defending Kyrie Irving, we're going to defend him in the pick and roll this way. Sometimes on the same team, you might defend 2-3 players different ways in pick and rolls and DHOs, to where in the G League, we're more or less defending everyone the same and then making an in-game adjustment. And occasionally, there's a few players that we made pre-game adjustments for, but for the most part, we try to be great at what we do in the G League as opposed to the other team. Now, internationally, it's definitely more opponent scouting and opponent preparation.
Very cool. Coach Spencer, I'm curious how Coach Pannone would approach implementing a European model here in the U.S. Broad
European
question, but let's keep it. Yeah. How would you, because you've been in the European model of development, how should we be doing it differently in America? Because I've always said, if America ever figured out a better development model, because you're already the best country in the world at basketball and your players rise to the top, I'm curious if they approached it from a European development model, say the best club in Europe, Valencia development or whatever it is, would that work here?
Oh, it would definitely work if we have the buy-in and mentality. Number one, coaches, right? Like in America, anyone can wake up tomorrow and be like, yeah, I want to be a basketball coach. And then they can go start their A. Where here, I was just with Aaron Fern in Charlotte, and we were talking about like the mentality on even coaches attending coaching clinics here are totally different. In Australia, he'd say you do a coaching clinic in Melbourne and there'd be 500-600 coaches there. How many clinics do we have here that have that many coaches in attendance? And so, number one, I think it starts with coaching, and then they're also getting paid more, right? So the international youth coaches, it's a job. Okay, for some of them, it's a part-time job, but it's a job. They get paid a little bit more, but they have to be certified. And I think that we can steal that. And then two, less games, more practice and development. In America, everything is games. Even the G League, which I don't agree with. I think they should either shorten the G League season in terms of games so you get more practices and more development, or I think you should extend the G League season for a month, keep the same amount of games, so you get more practices and development. And there is something to be said about developing during games, right? But you have to really practice those skills, hone those skills to be able to utilize them in the game. And then obviously, it gets into a little bit more player development philosophy of what I believe is having 3 different player development plans. But in Europe, they're training those kids on the footwork, the fundamentals, the passing, the one-hand passing, right? So, like, we'll see 14-year-old European guards that are coming off a pick and roll, throwing a right-hand hook pass as a strike to the weak side corner from the top of the key. And, they have to drill that fundamental portion of it to where our 14-year-olds are working on isolation step backs.
Well, or they're being limited by the coach and saying that's not fundamental. In their belief, that's not fundamental. And it's like, yeah, we're kind of stuck in this really old school mentality, I find, where coaches who have been coaching or are coaching now are, how do I put this nicely, still justifying what they're doing based on a coach that did the same thing 40 years ago.
Right. I mean, the game is evolving. Like everything, the world is evolving, right? The world today is nowhere near what it was 40 years ago. It's not what it was 10 years ago. And the game of basketball is constantly evolving. And I think coaches that are kind of stuck in that way, they're not growing, right? And so you have to have that adapt or die mentality. And if you don't have a growth mindset of constantly improving and growing, then you're also limiting your players' growth.
Coach Damien asks, how are you or your assistants tracking the effectiveness of your ATOs as the game progresses, or say in post review?
I count it effective if they actually run it. I mean, in the G League is different. It's a different animal than college, the NBA, and Europe. I mean, it's a totally different animal. But number one, can they take it from the board and execute it? And typically the ways that I run ATOs in Europe are different than what we did this year. In Europe, I would practice a lot of them in practice. So to me, like, I think every water break in practice, black team is getting water, white team is with you. You're drawing up your ATO. Black team comes back, they guard it. White team gets water, draw up a different ATO for the black team. White team comes back, guards it. And that way you're getting 3-4 ATO situations to draw up in practice. Meanwhile, not drawing it up for one team, for your black team, while your white team is just standing around for a minute, talking amongst themselves, wasting time. Now this year in the G League, we did a little bit of that. But one thing in the player development that we saw was our players struggle a little bit in taking plays off the board. And, so some of our mindset came to, if you're going to play at a higher level, a coach draws up an ATO that you've never practiced, you better be able to execute it. And our players really improved at that, I'd say, the last 10, 15 games of the season as opposed to the first 15 or 20. And then obviously tracking it to see, did we get a quality shot? I think people decide on ATOs whether or not it's a make or a miss, and I don't think that's the right way to do it. I think it's, did we get a quality shot? Did we get the shot that we wanted out of it? And if we did, then it's something that we would look to run again. And quite a few of our ATOs we ran a few times, and I tried to run ATOs out of different media timeouts and quarter timeouts, not just into game situations.
Well, a few thoughts. The one I just posted, the last second that you just shared with me maybe a week or so ago, that you actually have 2 clips of it working twice. How far apart were those clips? Do you remember?
I'd say there was at least like 10 games.
Yeah.
Maybe more. Maybe it was like 3 weeks. So that could be, that could be a lot more than 10 games. But I'd say 10 to 15 games that were apart.
Yeah, it's just interesting to see that. But I like how you said that, because I've heard that, and I know you know this from many NBA personnel, that it is a skill that they value, that they can run plays.
Right. Can I trust you? Can I trust you to execute? And, the last 2 minutes of the game, specifically, right, like that's where the NBA level more, college is different. Europe is different. Coaches can control the entire game, but the NBA mindset, right, is a lot of times you're going to let your guards call their actions. You're going to let their guard call their plays. And as our season began, we actually took some of that freedom away. TJ was on me every day about calling more plays on made baskets for them. But at the NBA level, right, the last 2 minutes of a game, right, that's where your coaches earn their money. I mean, players got to make the shot, players got to make the read, players got to make the the big play, but you have to put them in a position to where your ATO has created an offensive advantage. There's an advantage, but you have to create that through your ATOs in the last 2 minutes.
Good stuff. With that, so some of the development things that you've brought from Europe to the G League situation, what might some of those things be that might be different than what those players have been exposed to?
I'd say I did not bring as much of the mindset as I wanted as a way that we started out. And there was a few reasons. One, your roster changes all the time. Like you said, 2, we had a tremendous amount of injuries. 11 players missed 82 games. And they don't end up missing the games, right? It's the games, it's the practices. And then they come back on a minutes restriction. So, we had, I think, 7 guys miss like 7 or more games. And so they're out those games, out those practices. They come back, then they're on a minutes restriction. And then they're on a practice restriction. So being able to get more of that team mindset was in. And then we had a lot of rookies. And dealing with rookies and experienced players are totally, totally different. And so, I would say what I wanted to do and what I did do are 2 different things. And naturally, looking back at the season, I would have gone back and stuck to my guns on some of the things. But I think some of the things we did pretty consistently were pick and roll reads. We tried to do pick and roll reads. In Europe, you might warm up the first 10 minutes of practice with your pick and roll reads and passing to where, okay, this team is going to show in the pick and roll. This is how you attack it, with just your guard and your big. Then you add a 3rd player for your C pass. You had a 4th player for your triangle pass. You had a 5th player now to attack it as a team. And so we did some of that, especially with 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 players. But the mindset in America is different than in Europe. So when you're doing it in Europe, you're building it up, okay, with 2 players, your guard gets a first shot, your big gets a second shot. Okay, you put it to 3 players, then it's still 1 shot. 1 guard gets a shot, the big gets a shot, the other guard gets a shot. Okay, you had 4 players. And it's 1 shot each time to where you're focusing on the passing, the spacing, the timing, adding in pass fakes, right, to distort the defense, how you're cutting, when you're cutting, what you're looking for and what your reads are. To where here in the G League, if only 1 player is getting a shot and 3 players are on the floor, they become a little bit disinterested, in which I would say our assistants, TJ Sane and Perry and Mary did a good job of turning it into competitive games when only 1 guy got a shot. So like they would play against the coaches, and if they made a shot, they get 1 point. They missed the shot, the coaches get the other point, trying to value it on the right read. But we could never really get it to where you were attacking it with 4 and 5 players taking 1 shot, because then the other 4 players, 3 players are sitting there like, I don't get a shot, and they're bored. And it's a big difference in mindset, because in Europe it's a tactical approach to where you're preparing to do that to win the game, to where the players here have the mindset of like, why am I not getting my shot?
It's definitely a culture difference in that sense. And I can imagine the struggles dealing with that. And certainly all the concepts that I share on Basketball Immersion are more in line with what you would have been used to in Europe. But Coach Jordan, I'll get back to your question about off-season player development. Coach Boswell asked, which style of offensive plays would you recommend bringing over to the NBA game? So, I guess maybe which ones transfer from Europe to the NBA, but which ones transfer to, say, the high school level? Are there particular actions?
So I think definitely it translates everywhere. Like if I think college coaches spend all the time studying the NBA game, and there's things to take away from the NBA game, but the international game is more close to the college game in terms of no defensive 3 seconds, 3-point line, and what the rules are more similar. To where in the NBA, the rules are totally different. But I think all of it translates. If you think of what the better NBA teams have done, you'll hear the Spurs talk about, the Warriors talk about, obviously Utah with Quinn Snyder, who spent the year in CSKA Moscow with Ray Messina. You see what they're trying to do is you always hear them talking about playing the European style game, which is ball movement, right, spacing, cutting. And I think what a lot of teams miss out on is the player movement. You know, if you had to break offense down with a European mindset, it would mean offense equals spacing plus timing plus reading plus ball movement plus player movement. And oftentimes in America, we miss out on the player movement. And I think with the way that the athletes are, with how athletic we are, right, if you can mix in the player movement to distort and break the shell defense, to take a team that now maybe tags from the double side and distort that to, in the mix of a pick and roll play, turn the double side into a single side to attack their pick and roll defense, I think it'd be a more beautiful game. So I think that's something that can translate for sure. And then the pace at which they run their offense in the half court, right? So the NBA, the G League, a lot of high school, obviously AAU is oftentimes determined on, you hear pace, right? The NBA is all pace and getting shots up in the first 7 seconds. And there's value to that. I mean, I think that's something Europe can steal from the NBA, is attacking quicker in transition. But to me, pace means how quickly you run your offense in the half court. How fast are you playing? How hard are you racing into screens, racing out of screens, racing on your cuts, racing into your timing to create the right spacing? And to me, that's pace. In the open court, I think it's racing. And so to me, you want to race the ball down the floor as quickly as possible. Number one, to generate high percentage shots, layups, fouls, threes. But then number two, to get into your offense as quick as possible, to now you have a longer time to run your offense with pace. And so now if you're forcing teams to defend you in the half court at a very high tempo, high pace half court offense for 20 seconds, you're going to generate a good shot. You're going to put them in multiple rotations. And, you know, Kevin Sutton, who's a good friend of mine, used to always say, right, like the good defensive teams can defend 2 good rotations. Well, in Europe, right, they're putting you in a blender. They're trying to get you into 3-4 defensive rotations because at some point your defense is going to break down. And the way that they train their offense is comparable to how we train our defense. And so what I mean is this. In America, if you're doing shell defense, and this goes high school level, college level, pro level, and a guy is a step, 1 foot off where he's supposed to be, we stop it, we correct it, we tell them they're being selfish because they're 1 step out of where they're supposed to be positionally. It softens and weakens the shell of our defense, and you're thinking about yourself instead of thinking about the team defense. Well, in Europe, that approach is offensively, right? So they have their spacing. They're going down and putting their X's on the floor. This is where you are standing. You are either on an X or on your way to another X. And if you're in between, you're being selfish. You're saying that you're more concerned with yourself, getting your shot, as opposed to creating the optimal spacing for your team. And so they'll teach there, right, if a guy is 1 foot off where he's supposed to be, now you're being selfish. They stop, they correct it. You're ruining our spacing of our offense. And so they do an excellent job with that.
I don't think I've ever heard a better explanation of the difference. And that's tremendous. That offensive shell drill example, that's really good. So happy to hear that. Coach Nuno here, and really just generally talk about the mindset of dealing with players that want stats. So they want their stats because they want to move to their next level, but their next level is not just based on stats, right? It's based on being a role for that next level for the most part, right? So talk about the mindset of trying to get those players to understand that.
I think, number one, it's a struggle, especially younger players. It is definitely a struggle because the G League is the junior college of professional basketball. Nobody really wants to be there. Everyone wants to be somewhere else. Everyone wants to make more money. Everyone wants to be at a higher level. Everyone wants someone else's job. And the common mindset is, I'm going to accomplish that by scoring a bunch of points. And so you have to try to train them why winning is good for them, why unselfishness is good for them, why ball movement is good for them. And, you know, what you try to do is have the mindset of this. Number one, we broke down all of the guys that got call-ups in the last 5 years. One of our assistants, Perry, did it. He broke down all of the players that received call-ups that weren't from their own team, right? So if you played for the Erie Bayhawks, it's not the call-ups you got with the New Orleans Pelicans. It's what you got from the other 29 teams. And what he found, it was like 77% or something of call-ups came off winning teams, not losing teams. And if you think about it from the mindset of this, right, like the NBA teams that are calling players up are teams that are losing. When you're not calling up from your own program, it's losing teams, and they're trying to figure out how do you win. And TJ actually set up a great meeting with me before the season with Stan Van Gundy, where I got to talk to him about basketball for 7 hours. And number one, let me tell you, that guy is awesome. He loves basketball. And I thought it was going to be like 45 minutes of his time, and we sat by his pool kicking and talking about it. It was awesome. And, he made a great statement of, if as a G League player, he had the mindset, if you can't help your G League team win, how can you help our NBA team win? And that's the right mindset. And if you can't help your G League team win, how can you help a high-level international team win, where winning is everything? And the high-level international game is better than the G League, right? So people will oftentimes be like, the G League is the second best league in the world, and it's not. I mean, you can't compare the G League and the Euro League, the Euro Cup, Champions League, domestic leagues, ACB League, the Spanish League, the Turkish League, Australia. I mean, you can't compare the leagues. And so you have to try to train them to where, if you can't help our team win, how can you help one of those team wins? And why would they want to sign you if they don't think that they can help you win? Two, right, at the next level, at a higher level, you're not a scorer. Right, so whether it's the NBA, they're not signing guys out of the G League to come in and score a bunch of points. Now, you can score, that can help it. Can you remember a scouting report? Can you play defense? Can you remember our offense? What can you do to help us win? Things that don't show up in the stat sheet. Can you get swing assists, hockey assists, right? Can you be in the gaps? Can you do the right thing at the right time? And then in the international game, like if you look at the EuroLeague, there's 3 players that average over 20 points a game. The leading scorer, or the MVP of the G League, I think it was the leading scorer last year, averages 9 points a game in the EuroLeague. He averaged 28 in the G League. And what you have to explain to players is, like, 9 points a game in the EuroLeague is really good. Like, you have to be really, really good to average 9 points a game in the EuroLeague. And if you go across it, if you look at high-level international teams, the teams that are really successful, right, they got 5-6 scorers because everything is played through the team. And so you have to try to take their internal and selfish motivation and use it to motivate them to play as a team and to win. And trying to break down concepts of, okay, every shot is basically a higher percentage shot off a pass. So do you want to score more points, average more assists, and shoot a higher field goal percentage? If you do, everyone needs to pass the ball more. Because statistically speaking, from layups to threes and everything in between, it's a higher percentage shot off the pass than it is off the bounce.
Tremendous. And every coach should go back and listen and write down what you said, because that speech applies to every level. Like, that's such a good way of explaining it to players, the high school level, AAU level, etc. Just that value of winning and how that translates to that next level for teams. That's great. Let's go back to Coach Newman's question, because it was a little bit broader, but it's a really good question at this time of year. And I know you spent time with Coach Thorpe in that model as well. It's about off-season player development. What are some things that coaches should be focused on for off-season player development?
Number one, right, I think you have to take the player. Is it a guy that is currently under contract, currently with a specific team that will return to that team next year? So is it a guy that's a sophomore in high school that's returning to play under the same coach and situation as a junior in high school? Is it a second, third-year player in the NBA that's returning to the same coach and system? And then I think it goes to role, right? And so you're constantly trying to grow and develop a player and expand their role. Every player wants to expand their role in some way, shape, or form. If you're the second leading scorer, you want to be the leading scorer. If you're the secondary ball handler, oftentimes you might want to be the primary ball handler. If you're the backup point guard, you want to be the starter. And so I think, number one, it's taking a look at their situation, what they're playing for, and number one, helping them be great within the system that they're playing in, right? So teaching them the value of the right reads that they're going to play in their system. So if you're running, let's say, the Princeton offense, right? So part of player development, and it's something that TJ says all the time, people think of player development as my ball handling, my shooting, my off the dribble shots, my layup package, putting everything in my bag. And player development encompasses everything. Learning how to cut the right way, learning how to read when to cut, learning the timing of the cut. And I think this is a great tool for us as coaches, right? When a player tells you, I can't play in this system, I can't play in this system, I think you have to flip it around on them and say, oh, so you're a system player. You're only good in a specific system. You're not a good enough player to be a good player in any system, right? Is that what you're telling me? Because a lot of players, right, they'll complain about the triangle offense. Well, Michael Jordan was a great player in it. Scottie Pippen was a great player in it. Kobe Bryant was a great player in it. Shaquille O'Neal was a great player in it. So you're saying that you have to be in a specific system for you to be a good basketball player. And I think as a result in player development, one of the biggest things missed out is teaching that player how to be great in the system that they're playing in, right? Because that's what's going to generate more assists, more points, more rebounds, more defensive stops. Teaching them how to be a great positional defender in their systematic defense. Are they dropping in the pick and roll and trying to solve it 2-on-2? Are they tagging even though they drop, pulling in from the weak side corner? How to be in the right position, how to make the right read. Then what are the defensive concepts they see in their league or in their style player? Are more teams showing in the pick and roll? So now in your player development, you're teaching them, right, not just how to attack the two players involved in the pick and roll. How are you reading the off-ball situations? And so I think in player development, right, it's not just about teaching guys how to play one-on-one and how to be great with the ball in their hands. How do you teach them to be great without the ball, right? How do you give them two things to be great at? I think especially at the NBA level, but at the high level, you have to have two elite skills. One skill that gets you on the floor, and then one skill that keeps you on the floor when the other skill is failing. So if you're a great shooter and you're not making shots, okay, now are you only on the floor when you're making shots? We gave you 5 threes, you missed all 5, now you can't play anymore. What's that other skill that keeps you on the floor? So I think developing players to be great at two skills and then not watering it down, right? Guys don't have to be amazing at 8 things. They've got to be great at 2 things. And I think they have to be good at 3 or 4 things. And teaching players how to become good to great at something, and then you're also expanding their game by watering something they're bad at, right? And I think you have to have an ownership mindset. So if you're working with a player that has a really bad weak hand, you're working on a lot of weak hand development. But until he owns that weak hand development, you're not encouraging him to use it during the season as much, right? Unless, like I use the terminology, if the game is over. If you're up 30, if you're down 30, hey, this is where we want to put you in game-like situations to work on the player development stuff that we've been doing. But until you own it in practice, in pickup games, you can't utilize it in situations to where games have got to be won or lost, because at the end of the day, that's more or less the purpose of almost high-level situations. You know, in college basketball, pro basketball, you know, at the end of the day, the name of the game is to win. And so I think having that off-season development mindset of teaching players to become great at something, but not just on the ball, off the ball, and learning how to be great in the system they will play in so they're best maximized by their coach.
It's great stuff. And I imagine that translates from what we talk about with a lot of coaches is like group workouts are more effective than individual workouts if we're talking about developing those things. And a lot of these just player development workouts that we're seeing on Twitter and everywhere else, they can help a player obviously gain comfort and confidence, but to really understand the game, you need to be in a group setting for these development workouts, right?
Yeah, I think you have to have the mindset of, right, like practice the skill 1-on-0, hone the skill 1-on-0 or 2-on-0, whatever it may be, so to where you're coming off a pick and roll and you're just learning what is the proper technique to throw that, you know, one-handed hook pass to the weak side. Then when they're throwing strikes with no defense, now you have mock defense. So now he's got to read the defender a little bit, right? And then you're turning to live 2-on-2 situations, and then you're implementing it into 5-on-5 situation, whether it's controlled scrimmage or encouraging them in pickups. You know, I think a big part of player development is giving guys when they're playing pickup in the offseason, like, okay, hey, you're going to play pickup here. when you're in the pick and roll, I want you to look to make the right reads, and you're working on those one-handed passes we worked on, whether it's pocket pass, hook pass, wraparound pass, and to where you're getting them to train it. And a lot of people, they just play pickup to get up and down and waste time. They're not actually getting better at anything. And so I think that's a good way to build it, right? If they can't throw strikes on air, there's no need to add the fake defense from the coach or the player, right? The mock defense. And then when they're throwing strikes on air, now you have the mock defense. They're making the right read, throwing strikes there. Okay, now you can add the live defense with constraints. They're making the right reads, throwing strikes there. Now you add the live defense with no constraints. Okay, now you then build it into a team concept.
Great. Let's do it. I love that. Maybe shifting gears just a little bit, Coach Luke asked, what teams in the NBA have a style of play that piques your interest and why? Besides New Orleans, because that's obvious.
I mean, number one, the way that the Pelicans play, and that was why I was so lucky, was they were looking for an international coach for their G League team from the top down. And also, Alvin Gentry loves the international game and the European game. And they're one of the higher assist teams in the league, especially a year ago in the way they try to move the ball and play their flow. But I really enjoy watching the Utah Jazz. Quinn Snyder plays, and I broke a lot of it down. The way that they space out of transition, the way that they play has got a lot of international flavor and European concepts, and he even calls a lot of his actions, after international teams. The Boston Celtics, I love watching Brad Stevens. I think he's a monster. The San Antonio Spurs, obviously, especially when they had Ginobili and Duncan and Tony Parker, and not for the same reasons as everyone else, but just the way that they played obviously had a huge international fundamental base. I like watching the Clippers with Doc River. The Milwaukee Bucks, I really like watching the Hawks when Coach Bud was there as well. And I try to stick to more or less those teams, and then I study a lot of different ATOs from coaches. But I spend a lot of time still watching and studying the international game because I think it gives you an edge. Like you said, everyone here is kind of doing the same stuff. Well, people aren't doing what Fenerbahce is doing, what Zalgiris is doing, and I think if you can steal from Andre Trinketti and Šarūnas Jasikevičius and Zeljko Obradović and then the Australian coaches, and I think it gives you an advantage because you're doing something different. It gives you a different outlook.
Yeah, it's great. It's good stuff in terms of that. And I love the point about, again, I think too many coaches
try and watch all the NBA teams. Focus on a few that you're aligned with, and then just use the others to get particular things, like you said, with ATOs. So that's a great insight. From Coach Corey, when you do have scrimmages, or when you maybe in this situation, you're not going to get to run the scrimmages, but when you do get to run scrimmages, do you have the teams play out of certain actions or certain sequences?
When I was a high school coach, I did all the time. In Europe, you just don't have enough players to do that. Like in Europe, the season is so long. It starts August 8th and it ends, if you're with a top team, it ends in June. And so the off months, right, they're kind of resting more and doing some more less contact stuff. I would in college if you can convince your player. Like I think that's a huge advantage, obviously, in the G League. Your guys aren't playing as much pickup together. When I was doing more pre-draft process and we had, 15, 20 guys preparing for the NBA draft, we had them run out of NBA actions, to where they could learn and become more comfortable when they were going to their pre-draft workouts. And they could also know terminology, when coaches, that's one of the big things. Like my first year with the NBA Summer League team, all of the terminology that it was the biggest time that I really understood, to where like the rookies were like, what's a Maggette cut? And so like trying to use that terminology in the pre-draft process so the players are more prepared when they went in for their 2-on-2 workouts and workouts against the coaches. But I think it's a huge advantage if you can do it.
I think so too. And I think if you're looking from a high school program's perspective, putting them in little actions and then being able to put a clip of a pro team running it too helps them appreciate it more and probably get more buy-in to be able to try and do different things to expand their games as well. So I really like that connection. Coach Brandon, I mean, following up on the NBA question, this would be the teams, if you were to pick 3 teams in Europe or overseas that you would study this offseason, what would you suggest to our members?
So I think a lot of it depends on what you're looking for, but definitely Zeljko, Obradovic, and Fenerbahce.
Always them.
Zalgiris with Šarūnas Jasikevičius. I would especially go back to 2 years ago when they were in the EuroLeague Final Four. Barcelona with Pezic. He's excellent. Partizan with Andrea Trinchetti, especially if you go back and look at not in the middle of the season when he was fired in Bamberg, but the year before that when his team in Bamberg was amazing. I think, there's a lot of great coaches there. You can even look at the coaches that don't have as big a budget and don't play in cups, but I think Andorra's coach, Navarro, is really good. I just started watching Obradoiro because one of the assistants from Valencia told me, he's like, hey, they run great shooters actions. And I was watching and texting to my assistant, our assistants, and I was like, you think we could try to run this next year? It's like 20 seconds of continuous movement and screens that end up with a wide open 3. But I think, a lot of the EuroLeague teams are really good to study, and there's different coaches with different flavors, right? The ACB league from top to down, Tenerife is amazing.
A must-watch, yeah.
Which I'll actually be doing a clinic on this on the 2nd for the coaches clinic online with all of the free coaches clinics. But if you have non-stretch bigs, right, if you want to play a modern style of play without modern players, meaning you don't have stretch bigs, Hapoel Jerusalem, where I was an assistant, they run a lot of 3-out, 2-in pick and roll spacing, and they play a beautiful game without having shooting bigs. So I think it kind of depends on what you're wanting to learn, because each coach, each country kind of has different things to study. And I think what you begin to learn when you travel abroad, right, there's no monopoly on the game. You can't have the mentality that America has the best coaches, right? And it's only the American coaches, because it's not true. We also don't have the best players. I mean, you can go down and look at Giannis and Luka Doncic. And, I mean, there's no monopoly on it. There's great coaches all over the world. And in Australia, they've got a lot of coaches that run their flow offense, right? And in Spain, they play a little bit different defense with their next pick and roll defense. And Germany is a league that's got coaches from Spain, Italy, Serbia, America, so like their league is more diverse, and then the French league is more up and down and a little bit similar maybe to the American style game. So I think they're all great to study. And I see a few questions about like, where do we do it? I get it all off Synergy. I used to post a lot of plays on Twitter. I can't do it anymore, but I still send out an email to international coaches, college coaches, high school coaches with a lot of the breakdowns that I do, and a lot of breakdowns I've done in the past are on my YouTube channel. But anyone that wants the email, you can give your email to Coach Chris, and I'll be happy to add you to what I send out.
And coaches, definitely go look at Ryan's YouTube channel, because it has so much gold in terms of the European game and just some insights. And I'll post it in here too. And you mentioned France, and I'm like you. I haven't watched much in France, because every time I watched it, I just found it was just too American, almost up and down. But Dijon from France, I watched them quite a bit this year, and they struck me as someone who's doing it a little bit differently there, and just great team in terms of that. But the other one is Asia, which you mentioned before. Asia is a little bit more relatable for high school coaches, I think, because they're really imperfect rosters, right?
They're imperfect rosters, but here's the thing, right? They're also trying to steal a lot from the NBA.
Too much from America.
Now what you're seeing more and more, like it used to be in Europe, they brought over a bunch of American coaches until they took what we taught them and made it better. And then in Asia, they were all about bringing American coaches in, China, Germany, South Korea, everywhere. And now you're seeing them start to bring in more, still bringing in American coaches, more than what traditional Europe is doing. But now you're seeing them bring in more European coaches and Australian coaches.
Well, and I've had that phrased to me as that's one of the challenges
with China's development and why they've been stagnated is they've stuck too much with the American model. So that'll be interesting as they move forward. Coach Widger asks why pro teams aren't doing as much full court, 3/4 court pressure. Now we're seeing that change, and Nick Nurse is changing it. And I have my ideas, but Coach, what are your thoughts on that? Why is this not happening a little bit more?
So I think at the higher level, right, the EuroLeague and the NBA, there's a few factors that go into it. Number one, wear and tear on your body. It's a lot of wear and tear to play that many games. In the NBA, you can, with preseason, and if you make the playoffs, right, you could play 100-something games. In the EuroLeague, you can end up playing, by the time it's all said and done, 90 games between that and your domestic league. So the wear and tear of pressing and pressuring, for that many games is obviously going to have wear and tear and create injuries with your players. And it's also going to take longevity off their career. And so I think a lot of teams do it. Number two, I think the guards are really good. All right, so it's harder to pressure really high-level guards because they're so good at attacking it. It is something I think would be super effective in different situations, like in the G League. I honestly believe, right, if you had like Shaka Smart press and pressure for 40 minutes, that would destroy the G League. In high-level Europe, the IQ of those guys, in the NBA, the IQ of those guys is too high. And then the practice time. To really be very good at that, you have to practice it. You have to practice the fundamentals of it, the rotation. It's got to be in your DNA. And you don't have enough time to practice. And if you do practice, you may not be able to wear your guys down like that because you have to prepare for a big game, especially in Europe. And if your guys are tired and you have, quote-unquote, the load management, although in Europe they're practicing guys twice a day anyways, which I love. I know TJ hates it, but I love it. And, I think that's a big portion of it. And then getting guys that want to do it, right? I mean, getting 30-year-olds that want to pick up and pressure for 40 minutes, 48 minutes, for 90 games. Whew. I don't know. I'd like to coach those guys that want to do it, though. I think it can be very effective, but I think that's the biggest difference.
No, I mean, you nailed it there. I mean, that's it. Is obviously this buzzword of workload management is so important, but it's also to a certain extent that for a coach to be an outlier in the NBA means they're on the hook, right? Like they're the one that if it fails, it's them. And I think we saw that with Pitino when he tried this ages ago, that it was just, again, it was his fault it wasn't working. Whereas, as you know, anything can work if you can get commitment and buy-in to it. That type of idea.
Oh, yeah. And, if you watch in Europe, John Patrick, who's an American head coach at Ludwigsburg, which plays a little bit of the Pitino press style, he presses and pressures for 40 minutes. And, which I love. And he overachieves almost every year with their budget. And, he brings guys in, and if they don't pass the conditioning test when they get there, they get sent home. And, his breakdown in the preseason from the footwork to the footwork drills is amazing. And he gets them to do it. He gets them to play hard as hell. Now, what he does is actually unique because you think the way that they play, that they've got to practice hard as can be. And his practices are relatively light, with emphasis and focuses on, because he wants them going incredibly hard during the games. And he had an amazing year this year in the German league where he was killing it with such a small budget. And, 2 years ago went to the Champions League Final Four, and he's amazing.
Going to be a podcast guest at some point. I think you were the one that originally connected me with him. I can't remember, but we just haven't worked it out. Yeah. And by the way, the German league, for anyone that gets a chance, I think it's one of the best leagues to watch right now because of the diversity of play within the league, right? Coaches doing it differently, almost with each team.
It's the most open league in the world, right? So you had Spanish coach in Alba Berlin, American coach in Ludwigsburg, German coach in Frankfurt. You have a Dutch coach who is phenomenal. I mean, that is a great guy to study. It's a Dutch coach named Johan Royakkers, who's in Göttingen, and they have like the worst budget, and he keeps them in the league every year. And the way that they show in the pick and roll, what they do offensively, like I can't explain what he's able to accomplish. He's amazing, right? Mike Taylor in Hamburg, American coach. They had a Slovenian coach this year in Ulm, and Serbian coach in Bayern Munich. So I mean, if you just go down the list of where the coaches are from, they're bringing a little bit of that style of play with them.
Coach Nuno, maybe if you're in the Facebook group, just give me a heads up. Maybe you can post all these names in the Facebook group. We have some American coaches asking us about all these names and spelling and stuff to be able to search them. So I know Coach Nuno could do that. I know he's posting some in chat, but post it in the Facebook group for everyone to go back and look at. Coach, maybe one last question. Just how do you see the role of the four in the NBA and the G League and the main difference in that role from Europe? It's becoming more like Europe, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously in the NBA and in the G League, right, everyone's trying to value stretch fours, which Europe is kind of done for maybe a little bit longer. So, I mean, everyone wants stretch fours that are switchable onto guards, that can defend multiple positions, can play multiple positions. In the G League, right, your four might really be a three. Oftentimes, your four is playing as a five, and your three is playing as a four. And in Europe, I think one of the biggest differences in Europe with your fours and your G League fours is your willingness to go to a second side. Taking the good shot, creating a great shot. So having your, let's say you run a top middle pick and roll, catches it semi-open on the pick and pop, right? The initial thought of the D League player is I'm going to shoot it or I'm going to dribble it. Where, in Europe, right, you're just going to quick swing that to the second side for another pick and roll, pick and pop to be wide open. And also to make sure at that point you've got, at least three players touching the basketball in the same possession. And so I think that's one of the biggest differences in adjustment. I think in Europe, right, specifically, Europe with their fours is going to show in the pick and roll. They're going to switch in the pick and roll, which is most NBA teams are going to switch 1-4 pick and rolls. Most G League teams are going to switch 1-4 pick and rolls. So I think having the diversity of being able to defend multiple positions and then being a good off-ball defender as teams are switching more pick and rolls, right, now being a guy that can read the scram situation from off the ball, recognizing like I'm here, the guard is now in the post, I have to kick him out as a four-man. And I think being a really good positional, off-ball positional system defender for fours is becoming more and more valuable.
Great stuff. Coach, so much gold. I hope everyone who was on the call, we got up about 35, so that's a huge turnout, as I told you before. So your name resonates with so many because of all the sharing and all the openness that you've done. So thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Listen,
coaches,
if you get a chance, follow TJ Saint, best hair on the market. Okay. When we hired him, his number one goal was to make sure I don't get fired. He executed that. That is a real guy that should have been the head coach of the team. And as many coaches that can pick his brain, like I said, he's been in the NBA and he's worked for Hall of Fame coaches. And he's someone that, was able to argue with me and convince me and change my mind on multiple different things. But also he gives tremendous hair styles tips.
TJ's tremendous. And he was on the basketball podcast as well, coaches. So search that episode. TJ dropped some gold on there and just great stuff too. And coaches, if you could give Ryan and myself at B-Ball Immersion a shout out on Twitter. I know it helps both of us. And Ryan, can you give your Twitter quickly? I know I can post it.
It's at Ryan Pannone. And I also forgot I got to give a shout out to Coach Ariel Vanguarde from the Philippines. He's a friend of mine, and I had to shout him out.
Luke Widger, who lives in Erie, just said that TJ's hair glows from the bench too. So that's great.
Oh, yeah.
And
It's phenomenal.
hey, we got to get all the Pelican brass on here. We got to get TJ another contract too. It's great stuff. So thank you, Coach. Appreciate you. And Coach he's accessible. So reach out online, and Coach Pannone will share anything that will help you. Thanks, Coach.
Thank you.